I'm standing in front of a place that doesn't look like it amounts to much, but it is one of the important sites in St. Paul's journeys. He came here 3 times during the missionary journeys mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. Let's take a look at some of those different occurrences of St. Paul's visit to this site known as Derbe. Now, Derbe is a word that, according to one of the Byzantine geographers, was a Lycaonian word, and that this word means juniper. And so it's named after the junipers that apparently were here at one time. St. Paul came to Derbe during his first missionary journey. He had first gone to Iconium, and then, after being beaten there, he left. And as it says in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, beginning with verse 6, St. Paul fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia. In Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, verse 6, St. Paul went to Lystra and Derbe. And these are cities of this region known as Lycaonia. And he went to the surrounding country, and there they preached the gospel. So Paul and St. Barnabas come here to Derbe, and this becomes the farthest extent of his first missionary trip. And he went here first, and then went over to Lystra, and then, after trouble in Lystra as well, they passed on through the region here of Pisidia, Pamphylia, and Perga. And they went by, and they were able to establish the church, make one last visit here in Derbe during that first missionary journey. And then in verse 23 of chapter 14, we see a very important verse. They appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting. They committed them to the Lord, in whom they believed. So one of the things that St. Paul needed to do as well is come here to Derbe, and in his second part of his visit here, he was able to go ahead and appoint the first priests for this village. And those are the elders. The word in Greek is presbyteroi. And that these priests or elders were appointed here, not merely as older people, but those who would be able to celebrate the Eucharist for the people that lived here. The second missionary journey of St. Paul went beyond the first. But he came back through his hometown of Tarsus, came through the mountain ranges here in Turkey, going through that pass known as the Kilikian Pass, and then returned to the churches he had founded, including this one here at Derbe. And we see this mentioned in Acts of the Apostles chapter 16, verse 1. That Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and that he's checking up on the community to see how the elders are doing in leading the church, as well as how the faith of the people is growing and how their own mission is continuing on. So that becomes part of his second trip here. The third time St. Paul comes here to Derbe is mentioned in Acts of the Apostles chapter 18. We see in verse 23 that he departed and went from place to place through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So he came back again through this area. Now, Derbe was sometimes part of Galatia and sometimes not. it depended on who was ruling at the time. And most scholars are not really sure at all whether Derbe was part of Galatia or not, but they think so. Since he had already come here 2 other times, this would be a chance for him to be able to strengthen the church that lived here. There are 2 other mentions of Derbe in the Acts of the Apostles. We see in Acts of the Apostles chapter 19, beginning with verse 29, that while St. Paul was in the city of Ephesus, that there was a gentleman there named Gaius, who was one of Paul's traveling companions. Gaius is one of Paul's companions from here in Derbe. So that even though it was a brand new church and was only a few years old, already St. Paul was acquiring missionaries. And it's very important to see that Gaius, mentioned not only here in chapter 19, but also in chapter 20, verse 4, that this brand new church was willing to send out one of its own new converts as a missionary. And that we too need to take a look and see how we can be exactly like the same Gaius who was with Paul when he was over in Ephesus. And also, as we see in chapter 20, verse 4, Gaius of Derbe is listed among a group of people who are traveling with St. Paul as he goes on his other journeys. So this is a very small little place. Matter of fact, we only know about it because of an inscription that was found by the villagers from a tombstone of the God-loving bishop of this town of Derbe named Michael. And if it weren't for that inscription, we would never know that this hill is the town of Derbe. But that's what they found, and it's this evidence that we have as a basis to show that Paul's success continued on for centuries, because the bishop of Derbe, Michael, came a couple hundred years later, and then in the year 381, another bishop from Derbe was at the Great Council of Constantinople in 381. So Christian community continued to flourish. May all of our Christian communities flourish as well.